police visited this address more than once over the years, each time recording routine observations. Yet the wider significance of those visits was not immediately clear. On Dublin's south side, Drimnagh begins its mornings in a familiar way. Terraced houses line the streets in neat rows, their brickwork softened by age and weather. Buses move steadily along the main roads, carrying commuters toward the city center. Local shops open their shutters, and parents walk children toward nearby schools. To an outside observer, there is little here that suggests anything beyond ordinary urban life. This area has long been defined by community. Many families have lived here for generations, and neighbors recognize one another by face, if not always by name. Routine is important. Rubbish is collected on the same days each week. Cars are parked carefully along narrow streets. People notice when something is out of place, even if they do not immediately attach meaning to it. In places like this, normality is not dramatic, but it is consistent. Among the houses scattered across Drimnagh were properties that attracted no special attention at first glance. They blended in, appearing much like the others around them. Curtains were drawn at night, lights went on and off at predictable hours, and there was no obvious reason for concern. Records indicate that for long periods, nothing about these addresses stood out as unusual. They were part of the background of daily life. Yet routine does not always tell the full story. Authorities later noted that some locations were associated with repeated administrative references over time. Individually, each reference appeared minor. Taken separately, they raised no immediate alarms, but when viewed together, questions began to form. Why did certain names reappear in unrelated contexts? Why did familiar places feature quietly in official paperwork more than once? At the center of this developing picture was a local individual known as Christopher Zambra. In the neighborhood, he was recognized in the same way many long-term residents are recognized, as someone who had grown up nearby, someone whose presence was familiar rather than remarkable. There was no single defining moment that set him apart in the early records. Instead, his name surfaced gradually, often alongside routine matters that did not, on their own, suggest anything significant. Drimnagh, like many urban areas, has always contained a mix of experiences. Some residents move on quickly, others stay for life. Some names become closely associated with certain streets simply through time and proximity. Records from the period show that Zambra's movements were largely local, tied to known addresses and regular patterns. At first, there was nothing about this that appeared inconsistent with ordinary life in the area. Still, small details matter in long-term assessments. Officials later observed that timelines did not always align as neatly as expected. Certain associations appeared briefly, then faded, only to reappear later in a different context. Why did these overlaps occur? Were they coincidental, or did they point towards something that was not immediately visible? These questions were not raised publicly at the time. There were no announcements or visible signs of concern. Instead, they remained within files and internal notes, where information is often left to rest until further context emerges. This is how many complex cases begin, not with dramatic incidents, but with quiet accumulation. Life in Drimnagh continued uninterrupted. Weekends brought local football matches and family gatherings. Evenings settled into their usual rhythm, with televisions lighting up living rooms and traffic easing as the night progressed. Nothing outwardly suggested that the area would later be discussed beyond its normal boundaries. Authorities, however, continued their routine work. Documentation was updated, addresses cross-referenced, and names entered into systems designed to identify long-term patterns rather than immediate threats. This process is deliberately slow. It relies on patience and consistency, not assumptions. At this stage, no conclusions were drawn. There was only observation. One of the challenges in environments like this is distinguishing coincidence from connection. Many people know one another. Many names appear repeatedly simply because communities are close-knit. Records reflect this reality, which is why early information is treated cautiously. Investigators are trained to ask questions without forcing answers. What does this repetition mean, if anything? Is there an explanation that has not yet been considered? As time passed, certain administrative references became harder to ignore. They did not indicate wrongdoing, but they did suggest a pattern that warranted closer attention. The same locations, the same small group of individuals, and the same timelines appeared just often enough to stand out when viewed collectively. Still, no accusations were made. At this point, there was only curiosity. Christopher Zambra's name appeared within this broader context, not as a central figure, but as part of a network of familiar details. He was not isolated from his surroundings, nor was he treated as exceptional. His presence in records reflected the reality of someone whose life unfolded largely within the same geographic area. The question, quietly forming, was whether that presence was entirely ordinary. In cases built on long-term review, the first indication of concern is rarely dramatic. It is often a minor discovery, something that does not fit perfectly, but also does not immediately explain itself. For those reviewing the material, one such moment came when documentation linked a routine address check to a timeline that no longer aligned as expected. It was a small discrepancy, easily overlooked, but once identified, it could not be unseen. That inconsistency, modest as it appeared, marked the point at which routine observation began to shift into closer examination.
That inconsistency, modest as it appeared, marked the point at which routine observation began to shift into closer examination. From that moment, records that had once been reviewed independently were placed side by side. Dates, addresses, and names were no longer considered in isolation, but as part of a longer timeline that stretched across several years. Authorities noted that certain administrative entries followed a familiar rhythm. Periods of inactivity were followed by brief clusters of references, then silence again. This pattern did not point clearly in any single direction, but it was unusual enough to merit attention. In most cases, routine matters follow predictable paths. Here, the sequence appeared fragmented. Why did these references surface when they did, and why did they then disappear? As files were revisited, officials took care to avoid assumptions. No conclusions were attached to the names involved. Instead, the focus remained on behavior as it appeared in records, movements between addresses, changes in association, and moments where timelines overlapped without clear explanation. This approach is standard practice. It ensures that curiosity does not become conjecture. Christopher Zambra's name continued to appear within this expanding review, always in a local context, always tied to familiar streets. His presence did not initially suggest anything exceptional. Records indicate that his activities, as documented, reflected the movements of someone rooted in a particular area. There were no sudden changes, no dramatic shifts that demanded immediate explanation. And yet, his name appeared often enough to remain part of the conversation. Other individuals also featured briefly in the same administrative spaces. Some were connected through shared addresses, others through overlapping timeframes. None were labeled or characterized beyond what the documentation supported. Officials noted connections without defining them, recognizing that proximity alone does not establish significance. In close communities, lives intersect naturally and frequently. What began to draw attention was not who these individuals were, but how consistently their details appeared near one another across different contexts. A record here, a reference there, each one minor, but collectively forming a pattern that resisted simple explanation. Was this merely the result of shared geography, or was there an underlying reason these details aligned so often? Timelines became increasingly important. When dates were mapped out, small gaps appeared where information was missing or incomplete. These gaps were not evidence of wrongdoing. In many cases, they reflected ordinary administrative limitations. Still, the repetition of such gaps raised questions. Why were certain periods consistently less documented? Was information being recorded elsewhere or not at all? Throughout this process, restraint remained essential. Investigators are trained to recognize that patterns can be misleading when viewed too narrowly. Every apparent irregularity was tested against alternative explanations. Could clerical practices account for it? Could changes in residency or employment explain the shifts? Each possibility was considered carefully. Meanwhile, daily life in Drimnagh continued as it always had. From the outside, nothing suggested that a closer review was underway. This separation between public normalcy and internal assessment is deliberate. It protects both individuals and institutions from premature conclusions. At this stage, no action was required, only attention. As the review expanded, authorities began to see how certain references extended beyond a single neighborhood. Addresses outside Drimnagh appeared briefly, then connected back again through familiar names or timelines. These links were not dramatic, but they broadened the context. What had once seemed entirely local now appeared part of a slightly wider picture. Still, no single piece of information stood on its own as decisive. The significance lay in accumulation. Each additional reference made it harder to dismiss the overall pattern as coincidental. Officials noted that when systems designed to flag repetition begin to do so quietly but consistently, it is often a signal to pause and reassess. Christopher Zambra's name remained undefined within this expanding review. He was neither central nor peripheral, but consistently present. His name appeared alongside routine matters that, taken alone, carried no weight, yet over time, his inclusion in multiple strands of documentation became notable, not because of what was recorded, but because of how often it reappeared. The challenge at this stage was deciding when observation should become inquiry. Moving too early risks misinterpretation. Waiting too long risks missing context. This balance is one of the most difficult aspects of long-term review. Authorities must rely on thresholds established not by instinct, but by policy and experience. Eventually, one review brought several strands together in a way that had not happened before. Timelines aligned, references overlapped, and gaps narrowed just enough to suggest that further clarity was needed. The material did not point to a conclusion, but it did indicate that passive monitoring was no longer sufficient. At that point, authorities acknowledged internally that the situation required closer attention, not because conclusions had been reached, but because questions could no longer be answered through routine observation alone.
Not because conclusions had been reached, but because questions could no longer be answered through routine observation alone. With that acknowledgement, the review moved into a different phase, one defined less by passive monitoring and more by structured assessment. This shift did not involve sudden action. Instead, it brought additional layers of oversight into a process that had already been unfolding quietly. The first change was administrative. Files that had previously been held within a single review stream were shared more widely within permitted channels. This did not imply wrongdoing, it reflected the need for broader context. When information crosses geographic or departmental boundaries, it becomes necessary to ensure that records are interpreted consistently. What appears ordinary in one location can look different when viewed alongside information from another. As this sharing took place, authorities began to notice how certain references extended beyond Drimnagh. Addresses in other parts of Dublin appeared intermittently, connected by familiar names or timelines. None of these connections were dramatic, and none were treated as definitive. Still, they suggested that the activity under review was not confined to a single neighborhood. The scope, while still limited, was widening. This expansion required careful coordination. Different offices maintain records in different formats, shaped by their specific responsibilities. Bringing these records together involves methodical cross-checking, ensuring that like is compared with like. Dates were verified, terminology clarified, and duplications removed. The aim was accuracy, not acceleration. During this phase, intelligence gathering remained non-intrusive and non-technical. Authorities relied on existing information rather than seeking new material. Open records, historical documentation, and previously logged observations formed the basis of analysis. This approach is deliberate. It ensures that any emerging picture is grounded in verifiable sources rather than speculation. Patterns began to appear more clearly when viewed at this scale. Movements that once seemed confined to local streets now aligned with references from further afield. Timelines that had appeared fragmented began to show continuity. Still, these observations were framed cautiously. A pattern is not an explanation, it is an invitation to ask better questions. Christopher Zambra's name continued to surface within this broader context. Again, it was not the content of individual entries that drew attention, but their recurrence across multiple locations and periods. His presence linked otherwise separate strands of information, creating points of overlap that warranted further examination. Importantly, this did not redefine his role, it simply reinforced the need to understand how these overlaps occurred. Legal considerations became increasingly central as the scope widened. Any further steps would need to meet clear thresholds, ensuring that rights and safeguards were respected. Advisors reviewed the material to determine what could be examined further and what required additional context. This stage is often invisible to the public, but it is where much of the discipline of investigation is applied. As part of this process, authorities assessed whether existing frameworks were sufficient. Did current procedures allow for a full understanding of the material, or were adjustments needed? In some cases, additional administrative reviews were authorized to ensure completeness. These reviews focused on process rather than outcome, examining how information flowed and where it might have stalled. The widening scope also brought an increased awareness of time. Events that had occurred years apart were now considered alongside one another. This long view can be revealing, but it can also be misleading if not handled carefully. Investigators were mindful of this risk, ensuring that context was preserved and that assumptions were avoided. Throughout, there was no rush toward conclusion. Each new connection was tested against alternative explanations. Could shared addresses reflect family ties? Could overlapping timelines result from coincidental proximity? These questions were asked repeatedly, not to dismiss concerns, but to ensure that any emerging understanding was robust. Gradually, the review reached a point where its character changed. What had begun as an internal reassessment now required formal coordination beyond routine channels. This was not prompted by a single discovery, but by the cumulative weight of aligned information. The material suggested that the matter under review intersected with broader considerations that extended beyond administrative curiosity. At this stage, a decision was made to elevate the review to a more structured investigative framework. This did not signal conclusions or outcomes, it signaled recognition that the direction of inquiry had changed.
The questions being asked were no longer about isolated inconsistencies, but about how multiple strands related to one another over time. That decision marked a significant shift. The focus moved from understanding whether patterns existed to understanding what those patterns meant within the boundaries of the law. With that change, the investigation entered a phase that would bring greater scrutiny, greater coordination, and a new level of attention to the material already gathered.
With that change, the investigation entered a phase that would bring greater scrutiny, greater coordination, and a new level of attention to the material already gathered. Responsibility for oversight expanded, ensuring that decisions were no longer made within a single review channel, but were assessed through established supervisory structures. This was not a sign of urgency, it was a sign of caution. Law enforcement processes at this stage are defined by discipline. Every action must be justified, documented, and proportionate. Senior officers reviewed the scope of the inquiry to confirm that it remained within legal boundaries. Advisors ensured that privacy protections and procedural safeguards were fully observed. The emphasis was not on speed, but on correctness. Coordination became more formal. Information that had previously been shared on a limited basis was now reviewed through structured briefings. These briefings did not introduce new material. They clarified what was already known and identified where understanding was incomplete. The aim was alignment. When multiple teams are involved, consistency of interpretation is essential. Pressure in this context did not come from deadlines or public expectation. It came from obligation. Once a matter reaches this stage, authorities are required to either substantiate their concerns or narrow the focus. Ambiguity cannot be allowed to persist indefinitely. This requirement places pressure on process rather than people, demanding careful evaluation at each step. Evidence review became the central task. Existing records were examined again, this time with a shared framework. Small discrepancies were revisited to determine whether they resulted from clerical variation or from genuine inconsistency. Where explanations were plausible, they were recorded. Where they were not, questions were refined rather than escalated. Throughout this phase, patience was essential. Investigations that rely on long-term documentation can be undermined by haste. Officials resisted the temptation to draw connections too quickly, aware that coincidence can mimic structure when viewed selectively. Safeguards were applied to ensure that each inference was supported by more than repetition alone. Christopher Zambra remained part of the material under review, but his position within it was still being defined. There was no assumption of centrality. Instead, his documented movements and associations were assessed in relation to time and place. The question remained the same: how did these records fit together, and what did they indicate, if anything, about broader context? Oversight mechanisms functioned as intended. Independent review points were built into the process, allowing senior officials to challenge assumptions and request clarification. This internal scrutiny is often misunderstood as delay. In reality, it is a safeguard against error. It ensures that conclusions, if reached, are defensible and fair. As coordination increased, so did the need for clear thresholds. Authorities assessed what could be established through existing material and what would require formal authorization to explore further. This assessment was ongoing, shaped by legal advice and policy guidance. The investigation did not move forward until each step met defined criteria. During one such review, attention returned to a set of documents that had previously been considered routine. When re-examined alongside newer material, they took on a different significance. The documents themselves were unremarkable, standard records created in the course of ordinary administration. What stood out was their timing.
Records indicated that certain entries had been updated later than initially understood, reflecting changes that were not immediately apparent in earlier versions. This did not suggest manipulation or intent. It suggested that information had evolved over time, and that earlier reviews had relied on incomplete snapshots rather than the full sequence. This discovery prompted a careful reassessment. Authorities traced how and when these updates occurred, confirming that they followed proper channels. Still, the implications were notable. If timelines had been adjusted after the fact, even for legitimate reasons, then earlier interpretations needed to be reconsidered. The revelation was unexpected, not because it altered conclusions, but because it altered perspective. It showed that some of the apparent inconsistencies were not gaps, but layers. Information had not been missing, it had been incomplete at the time of initial review. This distinction mattered. With this understanding, the investigation reached a new level of clarity. The focus shifted from questioning whether records aligned to understanding how they evolved. This reframing did not resolve all questions, but it provided a more accurate foundation for what came next, changing the direction of inquiry in a way that no single entry ever could.
With this understanding, the investigation reached a new level of clarity, and from that point, the path toward resolution became more defined. Once records were properly contextualized and timelines accurately aligned, authorities were able to determine which matters could be addressed through formal processes and which required no further action. This distinction is central to the rule of law. Resolution is not about maximizing outcomes, but about applying proportionate responses based on verified information. Where the review met legal thresholds, formal steps followed. These were conducted through established procedures with clear separation between investigative findings and judicial consideration. Any individuals involved were engaged through lawful channels, informed of their rights, and afforded due process. Public statements, where made, were measured and factual, reflecting the importance of accuracy over immediacy. Court proceedings, when they occurred, were structured and deliberate. Judges considered documentary evidence, timelines, and verified records rather than narrative accounts. The focus remained on whether standards had been met and obligations fulfilled. This approach avoided speculation and ensured that decisions were grounded in material that could be tested and challenged appropriately. Outcomes were specific and limited to what the evidence supported. In some instances, accountability was established through formal findings. In others, the conclusion was that no further action was warranted. Both outcomes are part of resolution. The absence of action can be as significant as its presence, particularly when it confirms that systems have functioned as intended. Consequences, where applied, reflected institutional standards rather than public expectation. They were designed to reinforce compliance and clarity, not to dramatize events. This distinction is often overlooked, but it is fundamental. The purpose of resolution is to restore confidence in process, not to create spectacle. Throughout this phase, care was taken to avoid overstating conclusions. Authorities acknowledged openly that the scope of proceedings was defined by evidence and jurisdiction. Matters that fell outside those boundaries were not pursued through enforcement, but noted for policy consideration or future reference. This restraint underscored a commitment to fairness. For Christopher Zambra, the resolution phase did not present a simplified narrative. Records relating to him were addressed within their proper context, without extrapolation beyond what documentation supported. Where responsibility was determined, it followed legal standards. Where it was not, that absence was recorded with equal weight. This balanced approach reflected the investigative tone that had guided the process from the beginning.
As proceedings concluded, institutions involved turned their attention inward. Internal reviews assessed how the situation had developed and how similar patterns might be identified earlier in the future. These reviews focused on documentation practices, information sharing, and the interpretation of long-term data. Such evaluations are routine, but they carry particular significance when applied to complex cases. The resolution phase also highlighted the value of patience. The time taken to reach conclusions was not a sign of indecision, but of diligence. By allowing records to be examined fully and in sequence, authorities reduced the risk of error and ensured that outcomes were defensible. This patience protected not only individuals, but the integrity of the system itself. Importantly, resolution did not answer every question that had arisen during the review. Some uncertainties remained, acknowledged as such. This openness was deliberate. It recognized that not all complexity can be resolved through formal proceedings, and that responsible investigation includes knowing where to stop. For the communities connected to the case, the resolution was understated. There were no visible changes to daily life, no sudden shifts in routine. Yet the knowledge that processes had been followed carefully and that conclusions were reached through law rather than assumption contributed quietly to a sense of stability. Officials later described the outcome not as an ending, but as a clarification. Certain matters were addressed, others were closed, and some were simply better understood. This distinction matters because it reflects how accountability operates over time. Resolution is often incremental, built on layers of review rather than single decisive moments. As attention moved away from formal proceedings, what remained was a clearer picture of how ordinary records, when examined with care, can reveal or resolve questions without drama. The story, at this stage, did not conclude with certainty or final judgment. Instead, it settled into reflection on process, on proportion, and on the quiet mechanisms through which the rule of law maintains balance.
That reflection extended beyond institutions and into the wider community, though its effects were subtle rather than immediate. In Drimnagh, daily life continued much as it always had. Streets remained familiar, routines unchanged, and the pace of the neighborhood steady. There were no visible markers of what had taken place behind the scenes, and yet awareness had shifted. Conversations, when they occurred, focused less on individuals and more on how systems function over time. For many residents, the case reinforced an understanding that oversight is often quiet and gradual. It does not announce itself, nor does it interrupt everyday life unless absolutely necessary. This awareness fostered a renewed appreciation for the balance between vigilance and restraint. Communities rely on both, the willingness to notice when something feels inconsistent and the patience to allow institutions to respond proportionately. Local services also reflected on the experience. While no single policy change could be attributed to one review, the cumulative lessons informed broader practice. Emphasis was placed on clearer record-keeping, better contextual notes, and improved continuity when information spans long periods. These adjustments were modest, but they mattered. Small refinements in process can prevent uncertainty from developing unnoticed. At an institutional level, guidance was revisited to encourage earlier synthesis of long-term data. Rather than viewing records as isolated entries, frameworks increasingly supported chronological review where appropriate. This approach does not assume significance, it creates space for understanding. When patterns exist, they are more likely to be recognized. When they do not, clarity is reached sooner. Training and professional development also incorporated these lessons. Analysts and reviewers were reminded that repetition alone is not evidence, but it is often a prompt for better questions. The goal is not to accelerate conclusions, but to improve the quality of inquiry. This perspective helps maintain fairness while strengthening confidence in oversight. Unanswered questions were addressed with care. Authorities acknowledged openly that not every aspect raised during the review could be resolved through formal means. Some matters lacked sufficient documentation. Others fell outside jurisdiction or legal scope. Rather than presenting these gaps as failures, they were recognized as limits inherent to any structured process. Transparency about those limits is essential to trust. Importantly, there was no attempt to extend conclusions beyond what had been established. The narrative remained grounded in records and outcomes, avoiding speculation about alternative possibilities. This restraint reflected the same principles that guided the investigation itself. Responsible reflection does not seek certainty where none exists. For the community, the lasting impact was largely educational. It highlighted how ordinary environments can intersect with complex administrative systems without physical disruption. Familiar streets and addresses remained unchanged, but understanding deepened. People became more aware that attention to detail maintained over time is often what allows clarity to emerge. The case also served as a reminder that accountability is cumulative. It does not depend on a single action or decision, but on the consistent application of standards. Each record, each review, and each safeguard contributes to a larger framework designed to balance individual rights with public responsibility. Over time, references to the matter faded from discussion, settling into institutional memory rather than public conversation. Its influence persisted quietly, shaping how future reviews were approached and how early inconsistencies were framed. This is often how meaningful change occurs, not through dramatic shifts, but through sustained adjustment. As the story draws to a close, what remains most striking is not any single outcome, but the process itself. What began in an ordinary setting unfolded through routine observation, careful review, and measured response. No moment alone revealed the full picture. Understanding emerged only when information was revisited, aligned, and examined with patience. Police examined this address more than once. Each visit seemed routine at the time, each record ordinary in isolation. Yet taken together, they remind us that in the most familiar places, truth often reveals itself not through urgency, but through attention and through the willingness to look again. If you found this story insightful, subscribe and turn on notifications to explore more in-depth Ireland and UK true crime documentaries.